I originally wrote this script back in 2020. Actually, it wasn't a script, it was a long Facebook post. Like, really long. A form of content that is simultaneously accessible and inaccessible in equal measure. It's taken me 4 years, more or less, to build up the courage to turn this into the multimedia essay I always wanted it to be. So, without further ado, here is why I believe Blackadder Goes Forth is one of the most important anti- and pro-war pieces of television ever made. Our story begins back in the bleak midwinter of 2020, a period of time where nothing of earth-shattering significance was taking place. For some reason, I found myself watching BBC iPlayer at 2 in the afternoon. To my delight, the entire back catalogue of Blackadder had been re-uploaded. With a lot of time on my hands, fortuitously, I relaxed into yet another rewatch of one of Britain's most beloved comedic franchises, starting, non-sequentially, with the fourth and final season of the show, Blackadder Goes Forth.
It goes without saying that the final scene in episode 6, Goodbyeee, is often revered as one of the most poignant moments in all of UK television. Captain Edmund Blackadder, Baldrick, Lieutenant George, and Captain Darling heading over the trenches for the final push was the perfect ending to a show that so aptly used comedy as a vehicle to highlight just how awful and pointless the First World War was. Whilst that scene is rightfully remembered fondly by those who have seen it, there are little nuanced moments within the final episode that really make the show so special. Moments planted within the preceding episodes, paid off by the conclusion. A lot of comedies struggle to toe the line between when to fire off a punchline and when to incorporate an emotional gut punch. What Blackadder does so well is that it carries its underlying themes of ethical morality the entire time. It isn't all jokes until a switch is flipped and suddenly we're told to be sombre.
This isn't a war, it's a murder. This isn't a war, it's a murder.
Blackadder isn't viewed as a coward for wanting to escape the trenches and his almost certain death. He's viewed as a realist. As an audience, we empathise with his most basic of self-preservative instincts. This underpins the emotional integrity of the show. Blackadder, as our protagonist, is our baseline. Though he's highly exaggerated as a person, his beliefs are easy to align with for the average civilian and veteran alike.
Come on, George, with 50,000 men getting killed a week, who's going to miss a pigeon?
It's specifically important that this character is a professional soldier, rather than someone who opposes the war from the outset or gets caught up in it by accident. He's there in a capacity of choice, yet even he thinks this is too much.
That's the thing I don't really understand about you, Captain. You're a professional soldier, and yet sometimes you sound as if you very well haven't enjoyed soldiering at all.
Well, you see, George, I did like it. Back in the old days, when the prerequisite of a British campaign was that the enemy should, under no circumstances, carry guns. Even spears made us think twice. The kind of people we like to fight were 2 feet tall and armed with dry grass.
Oh, now, come on.
With Goes Forth, there's an inherent dark comedy to the situation itself. It's so obvious in its setting, but to make jokes within such a barbaric circumstance means having to confront the reality of it too, not just construct jokes with it as an innocuous backdrop. The success of any sitcom relies on its congruence with its characters and their location. The situation that informs the comedy, that morphs its characters into how they are. This is what arguably pushes the fourth and final season of the show away from the ones that preceded it. This important distinction of tone becomes clear when you look back at how the prior seasons shaped what was to come. In Season 1, we meet our iconic cast back in the year 1485, during the reign of Henry Tudor. Before his surname became simply Blackadder, Edmund's origin story takes him towards the mantle of the Blackadder, and we meet a man in the role of royal family prince, seeking his power, glory, and place in the annals of history. In Season 2, we flash forward to the Elizabethan era of the 1500s, and we're introduced to the Blackadder archetype that would persist throughout the following iterations. Dashing, intelligent, confident, and cunning. Again though, The narrative of Season 2 follows Blackadder's attempt to rise through the socio-political hierarchy of the time. In Blackadder III, Edmund is now a butler to the Prince Regent, against the backdrop of Regency period England, a mishmash of English historical moments around the 17 and 1800s. Once more, the narrative focuses on Edmund's aspirations of wealth to escape his servitude to those he deems beneath him.
I don't know why I put up with it. I really don't. Every year at the Guild of Butlers Christmas party, I'm the one who has to wear the red nose and the pointy hat for winning the Who's Got the Stupidest Master competition.
His goals throughout the first 3 seasons are of elevated status and self-serving interests. Pointedly, at the point of us meeting each ancestor, Blackadder is socially comfortable in each of these scenarios, relative to the world around him. But he wants more. This is what makes him such an engaging character. One so full of himself to not settle for good enough, and instead believing he is destined for more. It's a tried and tested comedy trope, to have characters reach for the stars, but to end up falling down the stairs. Yet this formula is changed substantially in Blackadder Goes Forth. If before Edmund sought out superficial self-interests, this time he's simply seeking self-preservation.
Ice cold in no man's land in 15 seconds. Now, the time has come to get out of this madness once and for all.
Each of the fantastic locations of seasons 1 to 3 serves to provide the narrative with genuine historical events and characters for our cast to engage with. But I'd argue there's not especially high stakes for the characters in terms of what's coming at them. It's more fantastical, and the artistic license used much more. It's self-contained. We join the characters during a well-established time period and leave before the transition out of it. A slice of their lives deemed interesting to chronicle versus it being either the beginning or end. The setting informs the comedy, but the setting is largely passive. The stage, as it were, remains constant. Yet in Goes Forth, by curtain call, the stage here is destroyed. In Season 4, we meet Blackadder, reimagined now as a captain in the British Army, and again in a position of relative status. Baldric, as ever, his understudy, represents the bottom of the culture. Usually a servant or dog's body to Blackadder in prior seasons, this time he's a private within Edmund's company. The series' typical interactions we see between Blackadder and Baldric highlight his disinterest the former has in being regarded as closer to the man in his service and not to his superiors. In this setting, General Melchett, whose headquarters and title represent safety from battle.
Don't worry, my boy. If you should falter, remember that Captain Darling and I are behind you.
About 35 miles behind.
Blackadder still aspires for more, but unlike the previous series, the ladder of hierarchy doesn't exist for him to climb. In Season 1, he believes he is destined, by blood and bloodshed, to be king, attempting ascension up the rungs of royalty by eliminating the people above him. In Season 2, he aspires for marriage into the royal family by beating out rival love interests to Queen Elizabeth I. And in Season 3, he finally succeeds in his aspirations of greatness by tricking the mad King George III into believing that he is in fact his son, the Prince Regent.
Make Britain great. You as the Prince Regent, and I as King Penguin.
Well, let's hope, eh?
The goal is represented in moving in front of the man ahead of him. In the 4th season, though, Edmund's aspirations are all adjacent to the path he is already on. If following the series' previous formula, Blackadder's goals would be in becoming a general or some similar military position for the sake of glory and adoration. This time, the stakes are different. The goal isn't status, it's safety. In Episode 1, Blackadder attempts to pass off Lieutenant George's paintings as his own to become the official cover artist for King and Country magazine, benefiting him a trip out of the trenches and onwards to Paris for inspiration. In Episode 3, he becomes a stage show director in an effort to end up producing a variety performance back in London. In Episode 4, Blackadder attempts to transfer to the Royal Flying Corps, choosing safety in the skies over that of the front lines. This one being significant because of how the inner hierarchies and cultures of the armed services view each other. There is a genuine disdain-laced desperation that Blackadder shows for this particular cunning plan.
For magnificent men, read biggest show-offs since Lady Godiva entered the royal enclosure at Ascot claiming she had literally nothing to wear. I don't care how many times they go up diddly-up, they're still gits.
Finally, in episode 6, Edmund scraps a new career opportunity and instead tries to pass himself off as insane in order to be sent home. This, importantly, is arguably the only time Blackadder allows himself to be viewed as anything less than confident under pressure. The desperation in the imagery of him wearing underpants on his head and pencils up his nose, making Baldrick's ignorant optimism seem stoic by comparison. Desperation increases as the time to escape decreases. The first time you watch the season finale, you're completely unsure of what's going to happen. Up to this point, Captain Edmund Blackadder has had numerous brushes with his mortality. He's escaped death by firing squad at the last possible second, survived a plane crash and consequently rescued from behind enemy lines, and avoided a bombing attack that puts Lieutenant George in the field hospital despite them being stood feet away from each other. The through thread is that Blackadder is deft at avoiding death. But as each of the 6 episodes of the series shows, he is unable to avoid fate, as each attempt to leave the trenches is thwarted by circumstance and bad luck. When it comes time for the final push, with the soldiers lined up shoulder to shoulder, Edmund and George speak, and Edmund utters the line,
So we are, in fact, going over. This is, as they say, it.
I'm afraid so, unless I can think of something very quickly.
Company, 1 pace forward.
The established expectation is that somehow, through some form of cunning, Blackadder will deduce a way to escape his certain death yet again, and we as an audience will get to continue enjoying he and his cohort's escapades. But obviously, that doesn't happen. And as far as the chronology of the TV series lays out, the Blackadder bloodline concludes in 1917, making the ending that much more shocking and profound. But whilst those final lines of the series stand out for obvious reasons, for me, there's this slow creeping fear that comes now when rewatching goes forth. From the point of knowing the ending, of knowing that Blackadder's fate is sealed in that call for the final push, we know how futile his efforts are to escape. Each episode I watched, knowing I was inching closer to Goodbyeee, a little bit of dread increased amongst the comedy. There's almost this psychological response of being able to enjoy the first half of the series by viewing episode 6 as something I'll deal with later. By episode 6, however, there was this genuine form of anxiety within viewing the show, knowing what was coming, and that silence would take the place of laughter. Again, perhaps there's something in human nature that, in spite of knowing how something ends, our innate desire is for outcomes out of our control to change. Like, if I watch this show enough times, maybe eventually I'll get the different ending. The ending where they escape. Because the reality of the ending of episode 6 is that it's purposefully uncomfortable. It's beautiful because it's the perfect manifestation of art to communicate an important message. But it's not that the ending of episode 6 is fun to experience. The show's creators didn't save the best joke to wrap the series on. They wanted you to sit in quiet contemplation. From the point of the men rushing into no man's land to the end credits is more or less exactly 1 minute of ambient sound effects, music, and then silence. For a 29-minute show to dedicate an entire minute of its runtime to thoughtful silence is a big deal. Ask yourself how often you did that today, this week, this month even. For a slapstick comedy, no less, to tell you that's how it's going to see you to the credits is a powerful and commendable measure of intent. Those final slow-motion frames of the men running across no man's land are seared into the memories of millions. An image we have where the real thing remains abstract. It's the perfect way to end the show, fading out of the trenches and into the poppies of Flanders fields, highlighted by contemplative silence. Whilst no one can argue this is the highlight, if such a word is fitting, of the episode, for me, there's actually one moment that hits just as hard. In the minutes before the final push, Lieutenant George, who throughout the series has been the exaggerated stereotype of middle-class blissful ignorance and foolishly heroic British nationalism, completely changes his iconically chipper tone and says to his commanding officer,
Really, this is brave, splendid, and noble. Sir?
Yes, Lieutenant?
I'm scared, sir.
I find this such a horrible moment to sit with, as up until this point, George has been the poster child for British Tommy propaganda, his loyalty to the country he loves never faltering, his posture tall, his uniform smart and pressed, his chin raised and proud, his upper lip stiff, and his attitude ironically upbeat given the circumstances. And yet here, George finally presents himself with an honesty we've not seen before. He's a man suddenly aware of his place within existence. He's a scared man. A dead man.
I'm the last of the tiddly-winking leapfroggers from the golden summer of 1914. I don't want to die. Really, not over keen on dying at all, sir.
Away from the security of boarding school elitism, where the plums in his mouth first ripened, he recognises that things aren't just going to work out for him. The tone with which Hugh Laurie utters the line, "I'm scared," is performed so deftly. It's like he's now found the voice of reason that's been pushed to the back all this time, masked by motivational phrases and an unwillingness to really consider reality. Death is a persistent character within the series, with each character reacting differently to its presence. For George, it exists firmly in the abstract, shielded by youthful exuberance, because he even goes so far as to idolise the idea of dying for his country.
We want orders to death or glory. When are we going to give Fritz a taste of our British spunk?
George, please.
In a moment that perfectly utilises his character's trademark British gibberish, George reflects on how the atmosphere of signing up without a second thought with his friends has progressed to them all being dead, and him, seemingly, being next in line.
Well, for God's sake, George, how long have you been in the army?
Well, me? Oh, I joined up straight away, sir. August the 4th, 1914. Oh, what a day that was. Myself and the rest of the fellows leapfrogging down to the Cambridge recruiting office and then playing tiddlywinks in the queue. We'd hammered Oxford's tiddlywinkers only the week before, and there we were, off to hammer the Bosch. Crashingly superb bunch of blokes. Fine, clean-limbed. Even our acne had a strange nobility about it.
Yes, and how are all the boys now?
Oh, well, Jocko and the Badger bought it at the first Ypres, unfortunately. Quite a shock, that. I remember Bumfluff's housemaster wrote and told me that Sticky'd been out for a duck, and the Gubber had snitched a parcel sausage end and gone goose over Stump's frog side.
Meaning?
I don't know, sir, but I read in the Times that they'd both been killed.
And Bumfluff himself?
Copped a packet at Gallipoli with the Aussies. So did Drippy and Strangely Brown. I remember we heard on the first morning of the Somme when Titch and Mr. Floppy got gassed back to Blighty.
Which leaves?
Gosh, yes, I suppose I'm the only one of the Trinity Tiddlers still alive. Lummy, there's a thought, and not a jolly one.
My point exactly, George.
At this point early on in the episode, George's facade of optimism begins to crack, where across 5 previous episodes, it had been ironclad. Blackadder is interesting in that it breaks a golden rule of comedy, that you should never punch down. Indeed, frequently and famously, Blackadder punches down, quite literally, on Baldrick.
Oh, sir, poor little Mildred the cat. What's he ever done to you?
It is the way of the world, Baldrick. The abused always kick downwards. I'm annoyed, and so I kick the cat. The cat pounces on the mouse, and finally the mouse bites you on the behind.
What do I do?
Nothing. You are last in God's great chain. Unless, of course, there's an earwig around here that you like to victimise. Baldrick, what's happened to you?
But the comedy works because Blackadder is punched down on those above him, and by himself for the crime of wanting more. But Blackadder also takes shot at the upper classes and how disconnected they are from the majority of society. George and General Melchit's bonding over middle-class frivolities like the boat race and university society songs are moments of mockery and disdain.
Don't want you missing the boat race, do we?
Permission to speak?
Oh, certainly not. Permission to sing boisterously, sir.
If you must.
Row, row, row your punt gently down the stream. Belts off, trousers down, isn't life a scream?
Fabulous. University education. You can't beat it.
The comedy works because if you've ever known someone in a half-decent English rugby team, you've met people who are shockingly close to the caricatures of Melchit and George. George lives in blissful ignorance because of the privileges he's afforded, and he's scolded for the lack of social awareness he has. Yet there's again this grim humour with how George recounts his friends gleefully gallivanting to sign up for service, because that protective layer of privilege obstructed him and others from the truth of what was to come. There's a dark comedy to it, that we as the audience know more than him. He may be better off than us in so many ways, but at least we're not so gullible. Yet there's also a considerable amount of empathy we have towards George in realising he really didn't know what would happen. It humanises him. He shirks off his privilege and exists side by side with any man because he believes in the ideals of war, even if he's soon to become a statistic
Don't
of
worry,
it.
Lieutenant. I'll come visit you.
Oh, will you really? Oh, bravo, yes. Jump into the old jalopy and come down and stay in the country. We can relive the old times.
The truth becomes, Britain needed people like George. We can laugh at George, the exaggerated character, but within the same moment we can also be thankful for the real people George represents. The creative choice to have Captain Darling join the company before the push also highlights another beautiful moment of storytelling within the episode. In Goes Forth, Captain Darling is the closest thing Blackadder has to a nemesis. A similarly ranked officer who, within the confines of General Melchit's employment, has found the safety he seeks. Darling delights in seeing Blackadder's attempts at succession fail because it maintains the status quo. There's a sense within the character structure of the show that, if Blackadder is gone from the front line, then it means a position for a new captain to be there instead opens up.
Come on, I wasn't born yesterday, Blackadder.
More's the pity. We could have started your personality from scratch. So, the training period is 5 months, is it?
It's no concern of yours if it's 5 years and comes with a free holiday in Tunisia, contraceptive supplied. Besides, they wouldn't admit you. It's not easy getting transfers, you know.
No, you've tried it yourself, have you?
No, I haven't.
Trust you to try and...
At no point in the season do Darling and Blackadder get on. They loathe each other and constantly nip at the other's heels. What Captain Darling has is security, because he's seemingly sold out his dignity to achieve it. Blackadder wants that safety too, yet is unable to bend his ego to do so to that degree. In episode 6, we see Edmund at his most desperate, but we also see Captain Darling at his, highlighting the lack of safety even he had from impending demise. When General Melchit makes the, almost consciously cruel, decision to send Darling to the front lines, Darling is on his knees begging for him to reconsider. Darling represents our lone perspective into the frightening reality of war and the desperation to avoid it. If Blackadder represents a child trying to find a sly way to avoid school, Darling is crying to his dad that he doesn't want to go at all. The scene of him being taken away being genuinely unnerving compared to the frivolity of the rest of the show, with an ominous shadow about to lead him away. When he arrives in the dugout, there's no snide remarks from Blackadder, no victory dance, not even a smirk. Darling is welcomed in, an equal. There's not a moment of time Blackadder and Darling don't spend on screen together where there's not a joke within immediate vicinity. Yet here, we're absent the laugh track. Not for the first time, moments of silence take the place where punchlines usually would be, and it feels unsettling.
Captain Darling,
Captain Blackadder.
here to join us for the last waltz?
Yes. Tired of folding the general's pyjamas.
I always considered Blackadder Goes Forth a shining example of anti-war media. Yet, as I watched the finale a few nights ago, I considered just how pro-war it is also, but in a way that feels respectful and not disingenuous. The show makes its stance on the conflict very clear throughout, though perhaps no more so when Blackadder illuminates Baldric on what the case of affairs was that started the war in the first place.
It started when a bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry.
I think you mean it started when the Archduke of Austro-Hungary got shot.
No, there was definitely an ostrich involved.
Well, possibly. But the real reason for the whole thing was that it was just too much effort not to have a war.
By gum, this is interesting. I always loved history. The Battle of Hastings, Henry VIII and his 6 knives, all that.
You see, Baldric, in order to prevent war in Europe, 2 superblocks developed. Us, the French and the Russians on one side, and the Germans and Austro-Hungary on the other. The idea was to have 2 vast opposing armies, each acting as the other's deterrent. That way, there could never be a war.
But this is a sort of a war, isn't it, sir?
Yes, that's right. You see, there was a tiny flaw in the plan.
What was that, sir?
It was bollocks.
It berates the senseless loss of life in the grand scheme, is happy to mock British imperialism, yet it doesn't present the casualties of war as a thing to laugh at. When the time finally comes for the push, the men aren't seen shaking. They don't try and run away, despite clearly wanting to. At the point of realising there's no way out, they still, in spite of the madness of the circumstance, see their roles in the war as something they are duty-bound to carrying out. They don't belabour the inevitable. The men walk forwards together, as a collective, as the bickering brothers they have established themselves to be. Their ability to be stoic in this moment is a beautiful show of respect to the soldiers they represent. This moment makes me reflect on how I would handle such a situation, and with honesty I have to say, probably not like this. In hindsight, we can mourn the pointless loss of life in World War I, inasmuch as we can mourn the pointlessness of any war, that millions have died for such ridiculous reasons, and so often completely disconnected with the people who set their fates in motion. But feeling sympathy for these men and women doesn't always carry with it respect. Sympathy becomes a matter of looking down on others, feeling sorry for them. Empathy requires us to imagine ourselves in another's shoes. Respect can become an abstract way of talking about something without actually feeling it. Like saying you respect first responders on principles versus when you actually meet one and you understand in much greater depth what they go through. Where Blackadder Goes Forth succeeds in its final episode is that it both highlights the pointlessness and absurdity of war whilst giving reverence to the millions who died. Losing the future of characters we've grown so fond of over 6 short episodes, and technically 18 prior, is in some small capacity an insight into what it felt like to lose loved ones to the war. We can become emotionally attached to fiction. The power of great storytelling is these characters feeling real to us because of the memories we have of them and the emotions they made us feel. I recently attended a stage performance of Blackadder Goes Forth, and within the sold-out theatre, comprised of a mix of mostly over 30s, I considered how few people would be there without having a story of the first time they watched Goodbyeee. Arguably, everyone there attending was curious to see how these actors would put their own spin on the ending, the crescendo everyone knew was coming. These iconic characters dying in such a finite way hurts. In terms of understanding those who have lost loved ones, this form of grief could never be it in totality, but it's something, and it's a something that stays. No one should have to experience the pain of losing someone through war, but if the fictional deaths of well-imagined characters can provide a slither of this, then it's immensely important shows like Blackadder exist. Where Blackadder Goes Forth so crucially succeeds is that it chose to tackle a historic moment where a lack of sensitivity towards its subject matter could have written it off within an episode or two. Again, referring to series 1 through 3, they're much more abstract to us now, the historical accuracy less pertinent, the presentation less significant. The setting of World War I, at the time of the series airing in 1989, represented a world where veterans of that war were still very much alive and present. Making jokes at the expense of a real-life tragedy is risky, which is typically why these real-life scenarios remain within dramatization territory, rather than comedy. But why World War I rather than World War II? In terms of setting and characters, a lot of the series could be transposed between the time period for the same effect. If you wanted the characters' interactions to largely take place within the trenches, with a view towards escape through the use of propaganda, the arts, and cross-promotion into different corps, then you could have had that setting the show between 1939 and 1945. You also give yourself a truly heroic ending, besting one of Earth's most reviled villains. But I think there's more profound beauty in choosing the First World War because of the ending to the conflict. The idea that no one won in a conventional sense adds so much more because it appeases anti- and pro-war sensibilities in a way that brings both sides of the argument together. Comedy becomes a vehicle for unity, rather than suggesting one is inherently correct for believing war is a justified means to an end. Humanity wins because the reflection on death highlights the cost, rather than it feeling like a victory march because one side's ideals mattered more. Again, the significance of our protagonist being a professional soldier adds so much more gravitas to lines like this.
I have a plan, sir.
Really, Baldrick? A cunning and subtle one?
Yes, sir.
As cunning as a fox who's just been appointed Professor of Cunning at Oxford University?
Yes, sir.
On the signal, company will advance!
Well, I'm afraid it'll have to wait. Whatever it was, I'm sure it was better than my plan to get out of this by pretending to be mad. I mean, who would have noticed another madman around here? Good luck, everyone.
My name is John Leo. I'm a photographer, writer, and mental health professional. Thank you for watching.